stay here with him and with you in Provincetowns, particularly under the theme to be young, gifted, black, ... and gay. And while that's important, I think just a bit of context. It is true, as you all know, your readers of literatures, that within African American literature, within what we might call gay, lesbian literature, the experience of black, queer, trans, non-binary peoples often tend to be peripheral. So it's nice to have come through a year where not just Casey's book, but also books by others like Doreen McKisson, who is writing a particular, from a lens and movement history from the particular vantage point of a black gay person. Michael Arseneau, whose book has been celebrated and is a New York Times notable book. He writes satire. And so many others. 4 black gay men's books out in 1 year, all of which received public acclaim within an industry that tends not to always center our voices, our lived experiences, is a really wonderful thing to celebrate and also lament that it's 2018, 2019 now, and that is still the case. So to have this conversation in this moment is pretty remarkable. So I'm really happy to be joined by Casey here. What we thought we would do, we don't really need a moderator. We're both from the black church, and we love to talk on some occasions when we're not running from crowds. Is have a conversation, and the first part of our time with you will be a conversation. We have some questions that we'll pose for one another. We'll open with a brief passage, and then we'll open up the floor for conversation. Is that cool?
Yeah.
So, I wanted to, I guess let's open with readings. You okay with that? Okay. So I don't want to wax too poetic but I will, about Casey. We met when Casey gave a TED Talk. How many years ago was that?
It's 2016.
And I was so stunned. And
let me tell the story. Darnell is too diplomatic sometimes. I was the last speaker at TED 2016, and the only reason that's relevant is because nobody knew who I was and nobody gave a shit. And so I was sitting alone for practically all week. And on Wednesday, I was sitting alone for lunch, and Darnell came over, and I had known of Darnell. Anyone knows of Darnell. You do not expect Darnell Moore to take time from his lunch to sit with you as a nobody. And so I sat there, and he sat with me, and we took a walk. And he could tell I was so nervous, and this was 2 days before I had to give this talk. I was so nervous, and he was supposed to fly out Friday morning, and I told him my talk was not until Friday afternoon. And he moved his flight to be with me and to sit in the audience and make sure I knew where he was so that I could see him. So it's so rare to have someone do anything like that for you that you know, let alone somebody that you don't know. And I think so many of us who work in language, who work as trying to be free black people, look to Darnell as a model and as a brother. And so he was going to tell a much more self-effacing story, but he really was the star, and he's the star of so many of our lives. So thank you, Darnell.
What I was going to also say was how taken aback I was by Casey's oratorical prowess, the brilliance of his words, and it was really clear to me that here was a person that had been deeply reflective about a theology of a life, theology of a black life, and his words, even on the TED stage, were sermonic. If you read his book, you know that his book is very much the same. So I would be honored to have you read, to open us with a reading.
Much of what I think Darnell and I write against is this idea that we are the exceptional, magical, lone Negroes, and to try to bring language to that without being a propagandist is difficult, and I think Darnell's work does this extraordinarily. This passage that I'll read is one part of my attempt to do that, while also, in some ways, Hilton Oz writes about Baldwin's style as sort of Hilton's words, high faggotry. And I love that. I love that language, and there's a way, there's a sort of pose, I think, of the language that can only come from a queer person. I hope I sort of captured that. So this is about the American dream. I was a summer intern at Lehman Brothers in 2008, which I write about in the book. It's a bad time to be an intern. For if you want to be an investment banker, great time to be an intern if you want to write a book. So I write about that and start then to talk about the American dream. I say all that to say the American dream is real. Not that foolishness you hear from politicians. If you work hard and play by the rules, you can do anything, be anybody in this country. I'm talking about the real American dream, the way the country actually works. If you know the right people, they can help you do anything, be anybody. Rules and hard work be damned, as long as they like you. They do have to like you, and that takes a good deal of work. This dream, of course, cannot be extended to 300 million people, and therefore cannot be confessed to any. So despite the fact that America is designed from rooter to tutor for most of its citizens to have nothing and achieve nothing, the political version of the American dream is essential. Kids like me are essential. Something and or someone has to keep the steam down. Perhaps that's why this crazy thing happened that I wasn't going to tell you about, since I think I've made my point. But it's one of those stories that will make you want to die all over again if you die without telling, so I'll just tell it real quick. One summer evening, not too long ago, as I stood near the end of a long buffet line in Dallas, I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. I rarely like to be touched without notice, so I just stood there a second or two, hoping it might be a phantom sensation before I glanced back. I saw then that the hand belonged to George W. Bush. For some reason, the 43rd President of the United States has to stand in line for dinner just like normal people. And also like normal people, but unlike me, he did not want to loiter there fondling lint in his pocket and pretending to appreciate the art on the walls, which was his. The president wanted to talk. Fine. So we talked as we moved along the line and put a few rolls and potatoes and, if I remember correctly, a slice of salmon apiece on our plates. The Secret Service or somebody took the president's plate once it was full. They did not take mine, so I held it between myself and the president, who squared up with me before we went to our seats. "Let me ask you something," he said, scrunched his mouth. "Was your dad around?" This felt as out of the blue to me then as it may feel to you now. For 6 or 7 minutes, the president and I had run a pretty good gamut of gab, talked about his paintings and his school days and his brother Jeb, who was at that time campaigning poorly to be the 45th president. Yet after all that, Mr. Bush needed to know, or wanted to know, I'm trying not to speculate, whether I had grown up with a father. And since I had mastered the art of giving people exactly what I thought they wanted, which got me into a lot of trouble, not all of it bad, I replied, without even thinking much, "No, sir. Both of my parents were gone by the time I was 12, which was not quite true, but not entirely untrue either. I don't remember what he said right after that, but I do know, because there's video evidence, that 2 years passed and I remained on the president's mind. He was sitting on a stage in Beverly Hills being interviewed by a gentleman who had also been famous for a long time, first for his success in finance, then for the felonies which had in part made the success possible, and finally, as is the American way, for his good deeds. The man wanted to hear about the president's latest good deed, a program that he and the 42nd president had launched around the time we met. Mr. Bush seized the opportunity to share with a check this out flick of his hand, a case study. So I'm sitting next to a young African-American kid. So I said, "What do you do, man?" He said, he skips ahead. I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Dallas." "Where?" "South Oak Cliff." The president lowers his voice as he tells this part. "South Oak Cliffs, you know, on the other side of the Trinity River." Then resumes. I said, "Wow, did you go to college?" He said, "Yeah, I went to Yale." He does an all-shucks shrug, voice low again. "That's where I happen to go." Then he looks down and continues. And I said, "Interesting, you know, you must have had parents who drove you." He said, not at all. My dad died early. My mother's in prison. But I had an aunt that focused me, plus I was a pretty good football player. I said, I didn't know Yale cared about football. Then he smothers the laugh line. Anyway, so he goes to Harvard Business School and he applies for the program. Now, when I first heard the president's story, I thought, wow, that kid is impressive. Then I realized that the president was talking about me. So I felt a bit confused and a little dirty too. But I was not upset at all, couldn't be. In our buffet-lined conversation, I had offered Mr. Bush a vague, compelling story. The kind of story I'd learned to tell at lunches years before, though shorter and more to the heartbreaking point. And he, being the world-class politician that he is, took that raw material and fashioned an even more pointed and compelling version, so inaccurate that it became a new delicious story of its own. The kind of story a man needs if he's going to keep his subjects from despair or mass unrest, or most of all, from the truth about their society. I imagine that is one reason he became president, and I reckon it is also why so many people said nice things to me like, Casey, you are the embodiment of the American dream. But it took me many years to realize that instead of smiling and saying thank you, I should have wept.
Wow, to be young, gifted, and black, and ... gay. So it's Sunday, yeah? It is Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay, I can't keep up with my days. So it's Sunday. I know that for some of us, this is sort of like church time. But I decided against my better judgment in reading something I thought I would read about faith, but I'm going to read about sex on a Sunday morning.
Yes.
I hope y'all okay with that.
Yeah.
It's almost afternoon. I'm reading this from a chapter called Touch, and one of the reasons why I thought I would read it is because often when we think about black queer life, sex, intimacy are the sort of points through which we think about death of black gay men, and or the over-sexualization of black gay bodies. But rarely do we think about the interior lives of black queer people, that is, the ways that we love, the ways that we touch and are held, the softnesses of intimacy. And it's one of the things that I try to do in the book, and that is to humanize what is often spectacularized, and that is black life, black love, black intimacy. So this is an ending of a chapter that is looking at that. I swallowed and digested my secret. The aftertaste of my week with him was so unforgettable. I would stick a finger down my throat to bring it up years later. Billy was his name. He was in his early 20s and stood a few inches taller than me. His agile body was buried under an army fatigue coat and baggy jeans. Hypnotic eyes lit Billy's smooth, honey-colored face and tempting smile. His measured movement through the thorny paths of the public park in Center City, Philly made him seem unafraid. We briefly played the game. I turned around and looked in his direction as he walked away. We caught eyes as he glanced back. He nodded. My heart raced as we gave each other the look that is understood only by two young men searching for each other in the night. Our gaze was our contract. There were no words spoken, no unease, just unfulfilled longings and erotic attraction doing for us what our silences in the day had prevented. Dead brown leaves crushing under our feet was the only sound we made as we searched in the dark for a place to go. I was too scared to actually fuck a stranger outside. Trees aren't mattresses. Police patrolling parks aren't friends. And homosexuality wasn't right, but because welcoming embraces were few, the hand of a stranger moving about my neck as I unzipped my pants was worth it. We didn't do much, but our too little was enough. Jerking off with an unexpected stranger outside, amid quieted moans, competing with the sounds of cars traveling in the distance, close enough to hear the breath of other men cruising the park was a new experience for me. I was 19. I wasn't yet gay. Billy was just my third or fourth secret. Always in the dark of the night and always alone, I found touch and sometimes violence. Not that time, however. I searched and left the park with an answered prayer. It was a peculiar blessing, not unlike Terrence's innocent kiss, or Jason's hug that fueled my wet dreams every night. Those encounters were memorable because they represented the fantastic, surreal power of fugitive freedom. Queerness is magic for those brave enough to make use of it, but it can feel poisonous for those who have yet to give into its power. I sensed Billy's magic. So I traveled with Billy to his home in Northwest Philly. No overnight bag or change of clothes, no toothbrush or condoms, no clue how I would get home, and no contact with friends for several days, no cares in the world, including for myself, no money, no sense of Billy's last name, but we held each other every night. For that short time when we lost ourselves in our sweat, stale breath, and questions, there was no abandonment or fear of rejection. In Billy's cluttered 10 by 12 foot room, our bodies intertwined. We shared secrets we would later forget. We giggled at horrible jokes. In his wisdom, he encouraged me to push through college. We held hands, listened to music. Only the faint concerns of acquiring HIV after days of unprotected sex broke our harmony. But even the thought was not enough of a warning to convince me to leave to get condoms. How could I? The presence of arms and hands and tender lips and empathic hugs and loving thrust and seeing eyes was too irresistible for me to fear death. I had buried my fear of HIV years before when my Aunt Cookie told me at the age of 15 that a second cousin I had never met was gay. She didn't actually say the word. She made a hand motion. Others used when they wanted to communicate that someone they knew was a fag. And for the fag risked, like any dreams of his desires for acceptable intimacy, seemed to always be broken. Aunt Cookie quickly added, your cousin's name was Darnell too. He died of AIDS. Her semantics gained work. I would never again say AIDS and gay without interpreting them as synonyms. My fate was sealed. I was gay, and therefore AIDS would be my fate, just like my dead, gay, HIV-positive cousin whom I had never met, who may have only existed in Aunt Cookie's imagination, but I kept my cousin alive in my dreams. I imagined that his skin was smooth and as brown as maple, his eyes deep and dark, his hands were strong, but smooth enough to be held by the hands of another man. His back was perfectly postured, strong enough to carry his lover from the sofa to the bedroom. He was a black man I learned to openly shame and secretly admire. He was my Aunt Friend's Keith. He was Leroy, my high school classmate who jumped double dutch better than the girls. He was Dre, who told me I was gay before I knew I was, who was hurt because I messed around with his boyfriend, like I messed around with our mutual friend, Ramik's crush, before he died. Dre died before I knew what was wrong. He was buried along with his secrets. This was the imaginative world black men like us who flirted with, fucked, and deeply loved other black boys and men, tried our best to survive, despite the ways HIV decimated those around us in the 90s. I'm gonna skip down. Whether my fate as a black man in love with other men was God's retribution, or some form of nature correcting the unnatural, Aunt Cookie's words haunted me like a divine foretelling. And as long as I would die from AIDS, fucking and being fucked raw by Billy in his strange row house in Philly would be of no consequence. I imagined death to be sweeter when the dying didn't die alone, so I sought other bodies as company. If loneliness and rejection are the worst deaths, I had died many times before. I have notes, and part of what we planned to do was to sort of pose questions that we had long, I guess, wanted to ask one another about our books, about the process of writing the books. And I want to first start with a line. I want to read a line from your book that stuck, like when I read it, it stung me and stuck with me, and then ask you to reflect on this particular line and how it shaped your writing of the book. You write, "For I have been so many things along my curious journey. A poor boy, a nigger, a Yale man, a Harvard man, a faggot, a Christian, a crack baby alleged, the spawn of Satan, the second coming, a Christian, Casey. I have been left once or twice, been found too, and every time I turn around, the world began to end again. It's ending right this minute, I hear. 3 cheers for the ending of the world, if you ask me." I love, first, like this book, by the way, the lyricism, the poetics, the sort of deeply revelatory prophetic read in the book is so stunning. And I'm just taken aback by your use of language, by the way that you language the poetics of Black life. Say a bit about that about that line. It's the lens through which I understand how you wrote this book. You are getting at the interior life of a complex human being. You're all of those things, or have been perceived all of those things at once. And in so many ways, Black characters, Black people are denied nuance, complexity. I have a friend that says white people can be all things. Y'all can have all type of characterizations of books. You get to be broken and build yourself up. You get to have sex and be sexed. Black people, not so much. Black characters, not so much. And here you are presenting us a nuance view into the life of a complex human person. So talk a little bit about that.
You're so good. Couple things. One, I had two great benefits as it pertained to my life as a writer. First of all, I was raised in a completely segregated community. There were no white people where I grew up. I had no white teachers. I might have had one white teacher in elementary school. There was maybe one white student in my middle school. There were no white students in my high school that I remember. The great benefit of this is that it never occurred to me that I was inferior because I was Black. And when everybody around you is Black, and we were all rather poor, or we had no money, to be more specific, you have to find more interesting language than we're Black. Well, no shit, everybody's Black. What else you got? What I loved about this passage you read, part of the challenge at the level of language is how do you describe people? He said brown as maple. That kind of language is not enough just to say, oh, he was a Black boy. What kind of information have you provided me? I write somewhere in the book, my mother had skin the shade of sandcastles. I grew up in a house full of Black women, and I knew many things because of that. One, you cannot generalize about them. Two, they're just like any human being, extraordinary and awful, and all the same. So that's one part of it in terms of bringing the particularity. Of course, we live in a world where Black people are denied this kind of particularity, but I did not grow up in that world. I did not grow up in a world where Black people were denied anything in terms of our understanding of ourselves, and that was a great gift, first of all. The second and perhaps greater gift was that I didn't read as a child. So Kurt Vonnegut said, literature shouldn't disappear up its own ass, and I think it has in so many ways. And so I did not have a set understanding of what literature was supposed to be, nor did I care very much. And just because we didn't read and nobody I knew read, my friends, the people who raised us, does not mean we didn't get vital information. So when I think about models for this book, my models are Lauryn Hill in her Unplugged album. My model is D'Angelo's Voodoo. My model is, Kendrick Lamar says on Section 80, his first mixtape, I'm not on the outside looking in, I'm not on the inside looking out, I'm in the dead fucking center looking around. That rejects the very notion of being a marginalized person. I haven't lived on the margins of anything. I've been at the very core of my experience, and I wanted the book to be that. And then I also, in thinking about this sentence, thought about Louis Armstrong and what he did with Stardust. Anybody know Stardust?
Yeah.
So for years and years and years, Stardust is this jazz standard. It's basically like hospital music. It's euthanasia. And then Louis Armstrong comes around, and here he is, this poor Black boy from New Orleans who's lived in whorehouses and all this kind of stuff. And he takes Stardust and he blows it wide open. Once you've heard Louis Armstrong do Stardust, who in the hell wants to go back to the old way? And so I thought very much about that, and I know, Darnell, I'd love to get your sense of how you wrestled with the genre, because so much of the genre of memoir is something that I resisted, rejected, was wary of, was ashamed of. I mean, it had all these issues, and so much of the process was trying to be with the language on the page without trying to, on every trip of the track, convince you that I wasn't writing a memoir just because there were all these other memoirs out there that bothered me. So I had to keep coming back to Louis Armstrong. Charlie Parker would say, if you don't live it, it can't come out your horn. So much of the challenge, and that's what I love about this passage you just read, so much of the challenge was trying to let what I lived come out of the horn, regardless of how it might read on the page. Did you experience that in any way?
Yeah, I think so. Like you, I didn't want to write a memoir. The first book that what I conceptualized in terms of a book was something like cultural criticism, social history. And a big part of that is because I was not ready necessarily to reckon, or at least to put my emotions, my affect, my heart on a page like that. But then there was this sort of imposter syndrome thing that I was dealing with, right? Like memoir as a genre is often made to feel so grandiose. It's, there's this idea that a memoir ought to have done something. And I'm like, well, we're black, we're alive.
Right.
We done did something.
That's right. That's right.
No, but so I didn't want to write a memoir. It wasn't until I had a mentor of mine who was reading through drafts of a book to be, told me beyond all of the sort of theoretical insights and all of the things that I was waxing poetic about and ideas, that it was the stories that had mostly and deeply resonated with her, and that stories have a way of doing more powerfully what theory attempts to do. So I had and then there's this thing too, that I'm from Camden, New Jersey, and coming up in a city where you're in K-12 schooling, and you don't really get access to the life worlds of people that look like you, who come from the worlds that you come from. I often say when I was in K-12, I read books about white people and talking animals. That's Animal Farm, I mean, mice and men. Like, I can go down a line of the many characters that were white, that were straight, that were sort of these typified American normalized family structures, talking animals. But never did I see the lived experiences of black folk who came from urban spaces, contested urban spaces, folk who had it within themselves to push back against mainstream narratives about their lives. I didn't never see that in a book. And I thought, okay, if for nothing else, to at least put language to what it means to grow up black in the age of AIDS, in the epicenter of hip hop, as a queer person from a space like Camden, New Jersey, is worth writing. So I was writing for my folk. I was writing against, or at least use the book as a way to write against everything that Camden and all of the Camdens in the world have been represented as being, as ghettoized spaces that have been bereft of culture, that where people are bereft of a type of self-possession and virtue. So I'm like, I'm writing for them. I'm writing for the 16-year-old me that needed to pick up a book and see themselves reflected as one alive, as two, as budding with potential. And by alive, I don't mean successful in the Americanized way we come to think about it. They don't necessarily need to know that I came from Camden, went off and got myself in a private school and got degrees, 3 before my mama got her diploma. What they need to know is that against all odds, not just those like that we count for successes within the American conception of a dream, but to know that their lives are taken seriously, whether they decide to succeed or not, whether they fail or make it. And that's what made me sort of turn to memoir. In so many ways, as I was writing the book, I imagined I literally would do this. I would close my eyes and see like a theater in my head. And I would be standing in the back of the theater, and all I would see is a little black person I assumed to be a little black boy in the middle of that theater, sitting by himself. A little naughty head like I had when I was a kid. And every time I wrote a sentence, I would ask myself, will he understand what you're saying? Will this speak to him? But something that I want to say about memoir as a genre, which the writer Kiese Lehman, who you all should read, says, one, memoir opens up the possibilities for writers to sort of, it is an autobiography, and some people, they want to pick up a memoir and read like a sort of 0 to whatever book. A history memoir is, and he says, can be a snapshot into a life, whether that is a minute, an hour, are a lifetime. So you think about how beautiful it might be to write a full book on an hour of one's life, and that's what memoir opens a possibility for. It also allows you to sort of queer genre a bit. So this book, while it is personal narrative, it is also social history and cultural history. It is a bit of social analysis and cultural criticism, and it allowed me to do all those things. Now, the thing that I'm thinking about as I'm even saying this is that one of the things that you and I share is this sort of religious impulse.
Impulse.
Yes. Yeah. And impulses, they come and they go. And in so many ways, like, I found myself when writing, I felt the same thing that I felt writing sermons. I don't know if any sermon, well, right? Like, sort of when you write the sermon, it's like this thing you feel, this sort of euphoric, almost like as if a friend would say, when you write, it's like the ancestors are like sitting on your shoulders, speaking into your ears, and you're just a scribe. So I felt these moments where my body was present, but I totally felt raptured, and would stop and go, whoa. Your book is like not just sermonic in that way, but there is a sort of trace of African American religiosity, of spiritualisms that's present. Like, you preach in the book. Like, this book is a sermon, y'all. Like, I wanted to give you an offering when I was done. Like, you can buy the book. But I'm really interested. You wrestle a lot too with sort of religiosity in the text, and I want you to talk a bit about. I mean, look at the title. There will be no miracles here. You ran into your friends. You come upon, well, this comes from a poster. Anyway, talk a bit about sort of the religious impulse, or at least the thread line through the book, what you did, the sermonic approach to the writing of the book. Sure. And even when you get this TED Talk, what he did not say is that he got up there and preached a sermon. And everybody in there, they were so moved. So this is reflective of even the way you sort of do like your oratorical moves in the world as well.
And I'll ask the next question, because you're getting away with how two things on that. First of all, and this actually was a huge breakthrough genre-wise, I realized that we actually are part, and you read Darnell's book, and it is, I love in the ending he talks about, we can name the people who have their feet on our necks, but we also have to name the people whose necks our feet are on. Right? We actually are part of a much larger tradition, which is the tradition of confession, which in sort of public discourse is sort of, Kardashianized. This confession is salacious detail. Confession is not that. The tradition of confession is the confession of an individual saying, I've really messed up and I need some help. I mean, I began this book simply because I knew something was wrong with me. I had accomplished all these things and I was very cracked up. And I wouldn't necessarily say I was having a nervous breakdown, but I went too far off and I was awful, awful sad. And Darnell writes, I think, some of the most important passages about depression, and the fact that he wrote those passages and is here living joy and giving joy to other people makes the passages even more important, perhaps, aside from their beauty and power. But I was in a very bad way, and so I started this book simply to trace those cracks with words. And before I finished, one of my closest friends from Yale, who I'd helped recruit and was kind of like a little brother to me, committed suicide. And I hadn't planned to write about him. He became kind of Darnell talks about that little boy in the theater. My friend became the judge and jury of whether I had done my job, because he came to me in a dream and he was sitting in a booth in a diner and he leaned back and he said, Casey, we did a lot of things that we wouldn't advise anybody we love to do. And so the whole exercise of the book, and I woke up and I just transcribed that dream in the book. people would ask me all the time, oh, well, what are your hours of working? I say, well, 2 chapters in my book are dreams, so I'm working when I'm sleeping. What are you talking about? But I had to tell it, I had to confess what Elijah was talking about, and I had to imagine what an alternative would be to those things that I had done. So part of the religiosity is a long, long, long tradition of confession, more than anything. The other part, my grandfather was a preacher, was a pastor. He preached. He started at 16 in Caldwell, Texas, and he earned canned goods when he first started preaching. He was a circuit preacher, and then he went on to found his church. And a preacher has a very hard job. They got to take a 2,000-year-old story and tell it over and over and over again and keep people from walking out. And in some ways, I mean, you went to seminary, I didn't, but in some ways, that is the standard of a book. There are so many other ways that somebody can find their entertainment. At base, we're in show business. I mean, what is it that is going to keep somebody here versus all the other places they can go? And here at $27 when they can go and get unlimited movies for $9.99. Seriously. It's a very serious question. So much of what I was doing in this book was taking all the old stories and trying to tell them differently. I pushed the chair of narrative expectations up, and just before you sat down, I pull it from under. I mean, that was the exercise. And so it actually, the religious training was actually wound up being useful in terms of the technical aspects of doing our job versus the spiritual aspect, which you can't fake. I mean, you can't sit down and say, okay, now I will have a revelation. I mean, either it comes or it doesn't, you see. One of the most powerful revelations, I think, at the beginning of your book is the revelation to yourself that you smiled as a kid. And one of the hardest things about writing personal narrative, Toni Morrison used to tell her students, say, don't write what you know because you don't know nothing. A lot of people see that as a warning against personal narrative. I think it's an extraordinary invitation, actually. What if the thing you spend the most time with is the thing you know least about yourself? So then the exercise becomes an exercise of recovery, an exercise of investigation. You stand outside yourself and try to see it. And sometimes it takes these sort of happenstance moments. So you had not been saying, well, now I will, my work plan for today is, well, did I smile as a kid? You just came across a photograph. And it seems to me that it kind of stunned you. So can you talk a bit about that on 2 fronts? One, what is the process as you're writing this work of recovery of yourself to then translate? Some of personal narrative is almost like translation, actually. To then do that technically. And then also, what was it like emotionally to recover little Darnell? And how is y'all's relationship now?
What time is it? It's like, this is therapy session.
I have bourbon in my bag if you'd like.
Pull it out. I have tea. You have a good drink. Wow, that's a really good question. So, when I was writing, I was sort of writing notes for what I thought the intro of the book would be. And I pulled out my mother's photos. She keeps all the photos. Like, there is not a photo, and she just of everything, like socks that I have on, everything. And I pulled out these photos, and I'm looking at all of the photos that she has of me, and in every picture I'm smiling. And like I'm this little boy with this really big head and these skinny legs, and in every picture I have this really, really big smile. Now it struck me, because as a person who has come through a life, having seen a lot of violences that have been normalized, right? So I grew up, for the most part, as a child, having watched my mother be physically abused by my father, and almost killed, right? So I see that happening at my house all the time. So there's a way that trauma blunts the consciousness on purpose in some ways, right? So what happens is you build up walls to protect yourself from seeing the things that could pull you back in and lure you back in and often cage you in depression. So because I had seen all of this, I never imagined myself as smiling as a kid. Like I totally forgot that I did. Like I just totally did until I saw those pictures, and it made me think, one, about the power of like youthfulness. How young people have a way of sort of creating, even in the midst of what might be possibly despair, avenues to joy. So that young boy in that picture who's on a big wheel, smiling, possibly stayed up all night the night before with his head covered with a pillow to drown out the noise of the violence that was happening in the house, and still went to school, and still somehow sat at a desk in front of a teacher who may or may not have seen all of his full potential, and still got all A's, and still smiled and went back home and did it again. And I'm telling you, that did something for me. It was like a transcendent experience, which, one, gave me like a life lesson as an old adult now, with gray in the beard. And I'm like, whenever I find myself hit with these barriers that say you can't, are these sort of moments in life that come and often push against me, push against joy. I remember the 8-year-old boy who somehow found magic when there should have been sort of despair. Technically, though, what that meant was the process of writing was this work of what I call like sort of locating the emotional genealogy. It was like an emotional history. I was sort of having to search backwards and sitting with like myself as a character, having to sort of uncover and things that I may not have had any sort of sense of at the time. And that work is painful. I will tell you this, I've done a lot of things. I remember one of the most physically laborious jobs I ever did was help a former friend of mine remodel his grandfather's house. Like I was on a roof. Like if you know me, you know that's not my thing. That's not my jig, right? Like that's just not the shit that I do. But we spent a week fixing this house, and it was physically taxing. I felt more taxed, both physically and emotionally, writing than I did putting that house together. Because to travel back into the sort of crevices of a life that you have slammed the door on and put a sign on it that says, "Do not enter." This is what trauma does. Is to walk back and have to sort of dance with ghosts, to sit in, so you're writing yourself into those memories. And not just the memories, but the smells, the heart sensations, the goosebumps on the skin, and feeling that. And it was both a scary and nerve-wracking process, but it was also liberatory. I should also say here that a big part of that was wrestling with my relationship to my father, who died while I was writing the book. And I literally on his deathbed, I was like, "You wouldn't, this is what you would do, you would just take the easy way out of this shit. You're just gonna die, I said that, and I'm writing about through a complex relationship with this man I both love and hate. And I'm writing him into a book and humanizing him and also holding him accountable and finally wrestling with all of this angst that I've carried for years. And he goes off and dies. But I will tell you this. I finished this book and in so many ways came to it like you did. I also before I went to seminary, I went and got a degree in clinical counseling to save myself. But I finished the book and was a different person. The technical aspect of sort of having to having to practice what I call self-reflexive analysis, traveling into my own interiority, into that of those folk who I even hated, was a really hard process. But I finished the book and I was totally a different person, and I was healed in so many ways too. So while I'm happy that the book has been in some spaces accepted by people and people found insight into it. It saved my life, the writing of it, which says something about the power of life narrative, and what it unleashes, not only in the reader, but in the writer. Yeah?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? It's very important, I think. That's all my questions are. Talking about that, because is writing personal narrative always healing to the writer? Because we also write in a tradition, perhaps the most important nonfiction tradition in American literature, of African American personal narrative. And Saidiya Hartman's work in Scenes of Subjection, and I just read all of Saidiya Hartman, just don't die without doing it. And I know you and Professor Hartman have been in conversation. But Saidiya Hartman's work on Frederick Douglass's narrative and the complications of him invoking, I don't know if, for those of you who have read it, Mr. Douglass invokes his Aunt Hester's scream very often. His Aunt Hester was brutalized repeatedly, and he invokes this, and so much of Douglass's narrative, which is so powerful, is trying to take the most harrowing experiences of his life and put them on the page in a way that convinces white people, y'all believe this. And I always wondered, there's one scene in there that and Douglass is a stoic figure, and you read it and it's kind of like a, autopsy in a way, how clinical it is. But then there's this one scene where I think you see Frederick break through, and it's him writing about his grandmother. And his grandmother's master died, and they took her and they put her out in the woods. And all alone, she was an old woman, and she had birthed all these enslaved people for this master. And you see Douglass, over the course of these 2 paragraphs, this sort of lament. It's like that cry in Sula, that cry that had no bottom and no top, was just circles and circles of sorrow. You see this human, we've seen an icon, Mr. Douglass, but we see Frederick lamenting his grandmother. And I always think about that, and I wonder, how did Mr. Douglass feel after he wrote his narrative? Was it actually healing for him? Because he had to flee the country after he did it. So, which is one of the reasons we never complain about our jobs, because we know the price that people have paid for us to be here as free black, gay people and write without threat of violence. So I ask that in 2 ways, 2 levels. One, in the spirit of Professor Hartman's engagement with Aunt Hester's scream, how do you decide what not to write? There has always been an expectation that when black people come to the page, they are here, much like AT&T, to provide you a trauma service. We will give you the craziest shit, and all this pain and all this suffering, we're going to offer it up on a platter. And so much of my joy in writing was deciding what I'm not going to tell you. So how did you decide that? And then more broadly, do you think it always, what makes the difference between personal narrative that heals the writer and personal narrative that metastasizes the pain?
Yeah. You and these questions. I first think about, in response to the first part, like Toni Morrison, who often repeats. Her process for writing has always been about turning her attention never towards the white gaze, but always to the interior lives of black people. So even in terms of making decisions about what to include, for me, I was very clear, like this is the type of book that somebody can pick up and say, oh, woe is this black life. But I honestly, when I tell you that the audience that I was writing to was that black boy, I had to train myself to write to him. That is to not make any undue apologies for anything that I was writing about. That is not to have to over-explain things such that a person who did not come from the worlds that I was coming from needed to get it in ways that white writers never thought about having to explain things to me. And so I guess the first thing I would say was that my ethic was that, one, that I wrote with care and honesty about the experiences, the people with whom I conjure in the book, and to always do so with an attention to them. So much so that when the lawyer for the publishing house called me to tell me that she went through the book and had notes, they want to make sure if you get sued, you had all this stuff. And so she's on the phone and they're like, so the lawyer wants to talk to you. And I said, okay, she's like, a white woman from Texas. And I said, okay. I had all these thoughts about a white woman from Texas, I just assumed, whatever, you're from Texas. So I just had all these thoughts about this white woman from Texas. And in my mind, I'm like, I didn't write the book for her. She wasn't in my audience. Honestly, was not there. So she gets on the phone, I'm expecting her to have some interesting things to say, and she says to me, your book really moved me. And I connected with it on so many levels, and I stopped her and I said, what? You from Texas? And I was like, no offense, but you're a white woman from Texas, like how are you? And she talked about how, in particularity, when we train our eyes to write towards particularity, that there is a way that one can find the resonances of human experience, even in that. Now, the publishing industry pushes back against that. They will say to a black writer, you need to be writing for, so that all people can find their way into this book. And I will say and I can give you an example of this. I can say this now because I said it to my publisher aloud. I was in a meeting with my publisher. It's a white man who isn't in publishing. And he says to me, well, how is this book going to be different than he starts listing the books of other black gay men? And I said, that's interesting. Because I want to know if you sit down with white writers at the same table and ask them to list how their book is different than anybody else's. Because the last I checked, when I go to the bookstores and the libraries, there's a lot of books about white gay life. And some of them probably carry a lot of the same messages. So that said, on one hand, there was an ethic that I was writing towards and always for and in conversation with my communities. And what to include then? The only thing that I could sort of determine is to be honest. And to ensure that when one is writing about black life, if one is writing about any life, to do so means that you're attending to both the violences and the joys. So I'm like, if I could talk about the city of Camden, which in many ways is often described via the statistics that people write about the city in terms of its poverty, in terms of the sort of all of the political and economic violence that had been done to the city, then there's a way that as a writer I can think about talking about the beauty that even exists in the midst of struggle. And those are just stylistic choices. Those are narrative choices. But how does one know then that all writers are healed? I don't know. For me, one can't be healed unless one is also broke.
Broke in.
Broke in.
Not like financially.
Oh no. Or broke in. So like for me, the break is essential.
Yeah.
And let me be clear with what I mean by that. Like there's a way that I think that self-reckoning and honesty with self is itself a type of, it's a break. And I can't get to what and healing is never a sort of destination we ever arrive to. I imagine though, in order to sort of be transformed, which I think we might mean when we say healing, which is a process I imagine to always be going on, I gotta confront those areas that those rooms that I told you I don't want to go back into. And I also don't want to make the claim that every book has to be about that.
In some ways, your house remodeling was a warm-up to writing this book, yeah?
Yeah.
Perhaps. I'm so moved by them, we'll open it for questions because we can talk forever. When you talk about the power of the particularity, I often say that if we do our jobs right and well, and there's no question you have with this book, you can go through the I, and when you come out on the other side, you've arrived at a we. Yeah, it's one of my most important models is Clarice Lispector, who, if you have not read her, read her immediately. She's not here physically anymore, but she's an incredible Brazilian novelist, and she wrote this book called The Passion According to G.H. And the whole book, the book opens, it's an upper middle class woman in Rio, and the maid quits, and it's the day the maid quit, and for the first time in some years, the protagonist goes into the maid's room, and she opens a bureau, and there's a cockroach. And the whole book is this woman and this standoff with the cockroach. And it's 200 some pages of this conflict. Now, what do I have in common with the rich Brazilian woman with the maid going in an extra room, okay, to see a cockroach? Yeah, I have some experience being from Texas with cockroaches, but you know. So that, I think, is the power, right? In some ways, and you know, we'll talk about this some other time, but it's so interesting. Maya Angelou talked when she was asked to write the inaugural poem. The head of the inauguration said, "We want you to write a public poem." And she said, "That's a contradiction of terms. Poems are not public. Poems are private, interior, and you happen to share it with somebody at the end of it." And it is this kind of interesting thing. Hopefully somebody asks you this question, because I had to admit in some ways my inability to care about the concerns of others in writing this book. And I would try at times to say, well, I want to write for this person, that person. And at the end of the day, I always edit it back to whatever it is I cared about. That doesn't say a great thing about me as a person, but it wound up being often the only way I could do my job. But anyway, that's why actually Darnell is not just an extraordinary writer, but he also is the new director of inclusion at Netflix. So congratulations on that. Let's give him a hand. We'll have everybody on television before long. Questions? I guess we can pass the microphone around. Are there any questions? Sorry, you're in charge.
Okay. Vanna Noir. Any questions? Yes.
What's next?
What's next?
Writing wise.
Oh, you start.
Well, I just...
Oh, wait, sure. So, can we also talk about the Black Art of Escape? So, you should say a bit about that.
Yeah. I just published about an 8,000-word essay in New York Magazine last month called The Black Art of Escape. That is a reflection on the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans who were brought to Virginia in 1619, and a sort of grappling with where we as Black people go from there. And my next book is, I'm just getting rolling on it, and it is tentatively called O Jerusalem, and is a book to some degree about God. And sometime in the next few years we'll know what that means.
And it's a beautiful piece. You also read The Black Art of Escape. It's beautifully written and well researched, and it's a historical treatise as well. So I'm working on, well, not working on as of yet. I'm outlining book 2, which is due like in April. And tentatively, what did I do?
This is why Darnell is Darnell, because I would be weeping in the floor. We're going to do in April, Jesus.
Yeah, it's tentatively titled Unbecoming. Visions Beyond, I think, the Limits of Manhood. I think that's what the second title is called. But inevitably, it's a creative nonfiction work that is wrestling with the questions of manhood and masculinity. in a moment in which we see very patriarchy being sort of deeply guarded and entrenched. And a pushback in so many ways against questions of how we might be better and new people. In sum, my thesis is this. It's often that we ask people what it might mean to be better men, to be more healthier men, practicing healthier masculinities. And I often say we are asking the wrong question. I think the better and the more correct question is, what does it mean to be a better human person? Because it is actually the identity, or at least the expectations that are attached to manhood and masculinity that set the world on fire and people's lives. So it's really, and I'm pretty much making this grand argument that instead of men becoming better men, we ought to unbecome and give the middle finger to all the ideas that have been pushed on us in the first place. And it is in that we'll find our freedom. Now, will people probably want to fight me after? I'm certain. But I actually think it is, it's a doorway for liberation for us.
I have a comment and I think 2 questions. First, I want to thank you for this presentation, which to me is very energizing. And it's energizing because of your being present and being, I think, honest in a way that reminded me of my mother, who would clean the floors in all the rooms. They were always immaculate because she knew how to do it. And that's the kind of honesty that I'm kind of feeling right now. It's like how clean the floors. We used to say you could eat off the floors. They were that clean. And that's the kind of honesty. It's scrubbed and it feels right. So that's my comment. My question is, one of my questions, is that little boy that was smiling that you saw in the pictures. I was really interested in who was taking the picture that you were smiling at, and I wondered if it was your mother.
That's so good. In a lot of them was my mother. There were a lot of Polaroids. I didn't think about that before. But what it made me, now that you have me thinking about this, what you're making me think about is the community of care that I was surrounded by, who saw me in ways that I may not have fully, that I haven't fully seen myself. And I try in the best way that I can to talk about a family who may have been described in every other way within national headlines, within sociological research, this black family that didn't have a lot of wealth, but did have a lot of love and care. They were the people behind that camera. They took pictures of me all the time, particularly the black women in my life. My mother's sisters, who all, by the way, when I was born, were all teens. And she was 16 when I was born, so they were like raising me as a young girl. They were black girls raising me. And they would just snap pictures of me all the time, which is actually really emblematic of their care for me and the way that they have always saw me, even when I didn't see myself.
And I also love that you saw that reflection, and what you gave back was that smile because you were seeing. And for a child, that's so important. My second question was about that child that we all carry within us that's been through the life of not being seen. And I love the idea of going into these rooms that we've closed off. But also the thing about the choosing the child and the age for our audience in our writing. And I listened to you talk about the little boy, and in my head I was thinking about the 15-year-old girl. And I like that as a focus because it's back to being kept to being honest, which sometimes it's not so easy to remember how to scrub all this stuff down so we can be honest like we were when we were younger. And thank you so much for this great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to thank you both. I mean, this is extraordinary. I'm affected. I am not going to walk out of here and forget this experience. And I'm just, as someone who used to live here in P-Town and always saw this as an exclusive community, have you two guys here, and for me to be here, I'm just really grateful. I really want to thank you guys.
Thank you.
you. I have a question sort of about method. I related to what you said about the trauma being kind of blunting consciousness. And I think that, and also what you said about how sometimes when you're writing, it's maybe not healing. And so, that being said, I have some things I would like to write about, some trauma from my past. And I'm wondering, obviously the pictures was one way, but I'm also wondering, how did you like evoke these memories and revisit those, like in not just like in a subconscious way, but in a very like specific way. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, other than just looking at pictures, how else did you do that?
So I actually, I interviewed, so this is, let me just say that my method was unlike a lot of my writer peers' methods. So one thing, when I told people that I actually, one, talked to folk that I was writing about to test my memory. That is, I would recall, you know, like I would write something and like, did you experience it this way too? And allow them an opportunity to say no. I have writer friends for whom that just is not like, you're not even entertaining having a conversation with someone. But that may come from my background and training as a therapist, right? And also like an ethic that I wanted to hold on to as someone who has tried to practice within his everyday life a type of transparency and honesty with the people that I love, particularly my family. So I interviewed folks. So my dad passed, I called his brothers and said, talk to me about the child you remember. Help me to see beyond, here's my images of your brother. This is what I remember. But talk to me about 15-year-old Boo-Boo. Who was he? And what that did was offer me a more nuanced window or a lens into the lives of people who had also been part of these traumatic memories, and allowed me to humanize it in a way. The last thing I'll say is, and I certainly couldn't do that with people I wrote about who had passed, which I try to not do often. But I like, you know, I wrote in community with folk. Like when I wrote about somebody and it was a testy scene, or a scene that was sort of calling upon us to travel back to trauma, I did share the writing with folk and let them read through it. And we talked about it. So that was one of the things. The last, I also I was not writing alone. I developed a writer's community. This was for my sort of self-care practice. Because I knew that I was in a house by myself for at least the first 3 months writing, and I looked, you know, it was an insane process. Like, I cried a lot. I did not wash. Like, it was just a heavy moment. And what I made myself do was have a community of folk that I would write almost every night and say, I wrote today. Here's what I wrote. Just, you don't have to give me comment, but I just need I need somebody to bear witness to this process. And that was super, super, super helpful. I told my publisher, when you are having people who write what Sarah Schumann calls difficult memoirs, whatever that means, you know, to the extent that some of us are more willing to wrestle with difficult memories, fine, but I don't know if any memoir is more difficult than the other. Maybe it has to do with this point of like what we are willing to be honest and vulnerable about. But I told my publisher that you should really be making sure that folk have access to therapists or other healing modalities. If you want a good book done, and you want someone coming out good on the other end of the book that you're going to try to sell, get them some support. And never feel compelled to have to write alone in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I was almost the exact opposite. I found human interaction to be a great occupational hazard. Yeah. So do we have time for one more and then we'll
One
shut
more
up?
question.
Darnell, you choose that.
Maybe if you both ask them together, like, real quick, and then we can like figure out how to close. Yeah.
If writing is confession, is reading absolution?
No. There is no absolution.
Right. Without absolution, where is the healing?
I think the healing is to be able to hold what you've done and know that you're more than that. I think the healing is to be able to hold the pain that has been caused by people who were supposed to care for you, your parents. To be able to hold it, not lie about it, but to be able to hold it and to see more than that. To be able to say, yes, my mother hurt me, but she's more than that. I think so maybe we just have a different sense of absolution, but I think the goal here is to see complexity. And it kind of goes to what Darnell says about foot on neck and, right, both ways, actually. Yeah. Okay, we've got to stop. So sorry, we'll be outside though. Thank y'all so much.